Hi, everybody. My name is Kajin, and today this event is part of a series of talks that I think we're taking the series of talks and events from a very old idea, Merantau. So it's a practice that's most closely associated with the Minangkabau, of leaving home to be formed by a journey. Well, an odyssey if you want to be very current with the movies coming out nowadays. So, and the person goes to Merantau, leaves their village, they go out to learn, to see the world, and if they come back transformed, or sometimes not at all. And I think we've been thinking with Merantau because ROCI, the overseas cultural interchange that brought Rauschenberg to Asia and all parts of the world, it's really a kind of Merantau as well, right? And it's an artist leaving home, gathering materials, gathering all kinds of stuff that he then combines, synthesizes into his work. And I think that's really, once you kind of see this process of Merantau, you can also see it as a process of translation, right? It's what survives the crossing, what lies beneath each work, what were the components that had to be transformed to result at today. And I think that's why we thought of this talk about translation. And I think when it comes to translation, I think there's no better person to talk about that than Pauline. So, I'm going to rattle off the CV part. And I'm going to tell you a little personal thing as well. So, Pauline Fan is a writer, literary translator. She moves between more languages that I can keep count of. But she's carried Ceylon, Kafka, Brecht into Malay. She's brought Trakel, Els Lasker Schuler, and Zahid Nasser into English. She's an editor. She is the creative director of PUSAKA, where she works alongside, custodians of Malaysia's traditional performance and culture. I think that's something that's increasingly under threat today. She also co-curated the 2017 Georgetown Literary Festival, the year it was named the Best Literary Festival at the London Book Fair. So, many things, many hats, but I want to kind of relate something personal, and this is kind of why I thought this, Pauline was the perfect person for today. Many years ago, I went to a gallery, and I found an old catalogue which had an essay by Pauline, and it was an essay on the printmaker Elsinore. And it actually became a really foundational text for me in terms of how I want to think about art writing and writing about culture. It's an essay that's a dozen pages, and she starts from a moonlit etching to a Sito Situmorang poem. She moves from Caspar David Friedrich to Max Weber, from the Grimm brothers to Tasik Chini, and she places things like the Penunggu versus with the kobold, and the Nixie besides the Duyung. And I think what it showed me is that an essay, a piece of thought, can hold histories, language, mythologies, and music all in one. And I've been trying to write towards that for a long time. And I think fundamentally, the essay showed me that translation, more than a simple A becomes B, is really a way of seeing the world. And I think that kind of perspective, which is all about, context shouldn't stay sealed off from each other, that we are far more connected than we think so much of the time, feels something that's sorely needed today. So without further ado, welcome Pauline Fan.
Thank you so much, Kajin. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And I'm glad you loved the Elsinore essay, because actually that was one of my favorite essays to write. And I really deeply, I think I really did deeply go into those aspects that you talked about, mythology and the act of translation. And you're right, translation to me is a way of seeing the world. It's when I talk about even Rauschenberg's practice today and relate it to the act of translation, I mean, I think the thing to keep in mind is that none of these things are separate. And I think more and more, as practicing as a writer, as a translator, and in the traditional arts, as you mentioned, I'm beginning to see more and more that things are very much interrelated. And one deepening a practice in one also deepens your approach in another. So it's just one of the things. And Merantau is, of course, like Kajin said, he's given a very good introduction about that idea of Merantau, because one thing that when Kajin invited me to give this talk, and he mentioned that he actually wants to explore a little bit about the ROCI Catalogue, one of the first things that struck me is that the entire project of ROCI is a kind of Merantau, and that immediately roots us in an experience or a concept that is very familiar, or a sensibility, I would say, that is very familiar and cultivated and imbibed in the Malay world. So I will just start by, okay, but I do want to start with actually, because I've been reading a lot about Rauschenberg, and of course, and I did know quite a bit about him, but as I was preparing for this talk, I really delved into his context, his milieu, his the circle, and actually I found a lot of connections, not just about him, but connections that I myself, with the sort of the artistic movements that I've been drawn to throughout these years, he was connected to many of them, in fact. And I'll just speak a bit about that context that fascinates me, and I absolutely love this part of his life, which was the Black Mountain College years, which was those early years of experimentation in Black Mountain College in North Carolina. So I want to start actually with, not with him, not with Rauschenberg himself, but with his teacher, Joseph Albers, who was, as I discovered, of course, we know the name Joseph Albers, and for me, that name Joseph Albers was actually very much related to the Bauhaus. He was one of the key figures of the Bauhaus movement in Weimar, Dessau, and Berlin. And those, if, for many of you know what the Bauhaus is, but of course it was this extremely influential movement of not only art, but design and a way of thinking about modernism that really shaped the modern today, I think, in many aspects of the West and also beyond the West. It was founded by Walter Gropius, who was this incredible architect, thinker, and it had people like Kandinsky, Paul Klee, all these great names were actually part of that Bauhaus movement. And Joseph Albers was a student at the Bauhaus for a while, and then later became a teacher there. And he became instructor, and he became famous for his, for what was known as, I think they called it the Vorkurs, which was like preliminary course or something like that. But this is actually a photograph of him teaching at Black Mountain College later on in the 40s. And I love this because it just shows, but for me, this could be a photograph out of the Bauhaus as well. You know, there are photographs of Bauhaus students and workshops, and it's very much, it has that, to me, it has that same kind of feeling. So, of course, what happened to Bauhaus was that when Nazism rose in Germany, and by 1933, I think most of them fled. They fled, like many intellectuals and artists of Germany at the time, especially in places like Berlin, they all had to flee, and including Joseph Albers. And so it's interesting that I think 1933 is the year that the Bauhaus sort of was closed down in Germany. And 1933 was, if I'm not mistaken, the year that the Black Mountain College was founded. It didn't have a direct influence, but many of the Bauhaus intellectuals and teachers actually fled to the United States, and some of them actually ended up in places like Black Mountain College. And Black Mountain College was founded with, on the ideas of John Dewey and things like that, and became a really place of experimentation and radicalism. So this, actually, I wanted to show you this, which is the Bauhaus. And that is Josef Albers teaching at Bauhaus in one of his famous Vorkurs. This is 1928. During that really radical time in Germany, especially in Berlin, I think, that intellectual sort of ferment. And, okay, just, I had to put this in because it's an incredible photograph of the Bauhaus figures. And didn't name them all here, but this is Josef Albers, here. And in the middle you have Walter Gropius, and this is Wassily Kandinsky, and you have next to Wassily Kandinsky, Paul Klee. So it's just these figures who are so enormous, you know, in what we understand today as modernism, I think. And to know that there is that very strong connection between these figures with also then what was happening several decades later in places like Black Mountain College. I mean, I think there is really a not only physical link through people like Josef Albers, but also definitely a spiritual and artistic link. So this is an early contact sheet by Rauschenberg of Black Mountain College, and this is like his teaching and or his learning experience, and many of the friendships that he forged during this period became lifelong friendships and collaborators. And I mean, when I was reading about them, it's just an incredible array of people. It's people like Merce Cunningham, John Cage was there. I think John Jaspers was in that circle as well. There was also the Black Mountain poets, like what's his name, Kenneth Rexroth, who later translated a lot from Chinese, actually, and also people like Robert Creeley. I mean, incredible, vibrant circle of intellectuals and artists who came together. And I think this is something that is important not only as a milieu, but as an experience of an artist who is never separated from another bidang, another field of discipline. I think their approach by nature was always very interdisciplinary, and it just, I mean, they all worked together. Like there were times when Merce Cunningham was doing a dance, and Rauschenberg did the props or the painting of the backdrop, and John Cage did the music, and these became these kind of happenings at the time. But I think that spirit of immediacy and making things, and also this idea of Gesamtkunstwerk, if you will. You know, this is like the total. This is the idea of in the German, which is not only modernist. It actually came even Wagner was using it. But there is this idea of the total work of art, and I think people like Rauschenberg definitely had, and the Black Mountain Circle had this idea that an artwork is actually not just in and of itself as an object or a text or a piece of music, but is absolutely interrelated and alive and total in an experience. So these were some of the things that I got very excited about when I was reading. And of course, people like, I talk about the artistic affinities and also intimacies. So people like Cy Twombly, who Rauschenberg also had an intimate relationship with and an artistic relationship. I think these are also things that can't be separated, you know, in the way these artists worked. Merce Cunningham and John Cage also had this incredible partnership that was both intimate as well as artistic, and extremely fecund for all kinds of reasons, right? But this is also, I love this work because it is also an early Merantau, I think, of Rauschenberg. He went with Cy Twombly to Italy, and he did these incredible photographic sort of documentation of their time there, and very layered in his approach. And I think there's also it's kind of a precursor to some of the later work of solvent transfer and the printmaking and silkscreen work that he did. He was already, I think, thinking about these layers of experience. And that's something I think in translation when you look at text upon text upon text. I'll talk a bit about that later. But it's always a layered experience. And it's always something that you're bringing things together one on top of another to make a whole, in a way. So, yes, so this was Rauschenberg photographed by Sai Tomley. I love that photograph. It was just very, very intimate and contemplative as well. Yeah. So, and John Jaspers, of course, who then also became a lifelong, both partner in many ways, partner intellectually, artistically, and I think they never called each other any labels, but they were just there giving each other this incredible life and exchange and encounter. And so this is the other thing that I wanted to talk about, is that idea of encounter. Through the process of Merantau as well, it's not only that you journey, or what is that experience when you are journeying, it's also what you encounter in that journey and how you take that experience of encounter and make it your own and bring it into your practice. And I think traditionally, you're right, you are supposed to be transformed. We are inevitably transformed by our journeys. And I think the value when you finally come back is always sort of what you bring with you from that experience, what you bring with your encounters. You're still the same person, but you're not. So these encounters, I think, whether it's on a personal level or artistic level, and I think for Rauschenberg, so much of it was always the personal and the artistic, always were very intertwined. Yeah, this is another, I just love this photograph because it's three of the greats, Cage, Cunningham, and Rauschenberg together. This is probably in the 60s, a bit later. But yes, okay, so the art of encounter. But I love that period because I think it speaks so much about the sensibility of how Rauschenberg approached the world and his artistic practice, and having that link with those earlier movements as well. Those are, and then later here, I think as you go into, or as he went into these different parts of the world, of course these are not experiences that are only confined to the Western world or the Western tradition. And I think it speaks a lot about Rauschenberg, that he wanted to go out there and experience other places, other traditions, other schools of thought, other histories, other narratives, and bring it into his own practice. And so he was definitely aware of that, not this kind of insular artist at all. I think he was very much about encounter in a wider sense. Now, this idea of Merantau, I wanted to, again, juxtapose two kinds of Merantau. One is, like Caspar David Friedrich, as you mentioned, which I've mentioned in the Ilse Noor essay as well. But, there is this idea of Merantau, if you will, even in the German Romantic tradition, this idea of der Wanderer, the wanderer, or the, and this is probably one of the most famous paintings of the German Romantic school, and Caspar David Friedrich, this is the Der Wanderer über dem Nebelmeer, the wanderer over a sea of fog. It's one of the iconic paintings, and it is the wanderer just going out into the world. To encounter what? Who knows, right? It's to encounter himself, to encounter the world, but really self-discovery, I think, in a way, and the unknown everything. It's one of the great paintings. Now, the other sense of Merantau, I think we can't talk about Merantau and perhaps the artistic experience here without talking about Latif Mohidin, who does come from a Minang tradition, and did actually do his very important Merantau when he went first of all to Berlin to study. And this was an early sketch that he did in Berlin of pagodas. 1960s he did this. And later became the kind of base of his very extensive series, Pago Pago, which was looking at Southeast Asia or this part of the world and translating it in a way into modernism, into a modernism that was also local. And I think some of the things that the local artists of his generation, for sure, were grappling with was how to make, what is modernism in our context, right? What is the modern? And I mean, certainly people like Rauschenberg, perhaps, I don't know, but I'm sure they grappled with their own things. Of course they did. But I think because of the sort of heavy experiences like colonialism and imperialism and Eurocentrism and all of that, and the art tradition, and I think the levels at which we grapple with those things are very deep. And people like Latif Mohidin were definitely grappling with it. He, of course, loved the European modernists. He was very influenced by abstract expressionism, especially German abstract expressionists. You can actually see that in his work. But at the same time, he was really looking for the spirit of what is that essence or spirit or something that he wanted to translate to the world in your art. And what is the way to do that? And so that, it's both, I think, for Latif, definitely a Merantau, but also a translation. And he is a translator as well. I mean, he is another one, I think, who encapsulates that sort of very interdisciplinary approach to everything. I mean, he is a poet, he is a painter, he is a translator, and I think he was always translating, even in his painting and in his artistic practice. Yes, so now we come to this really wonderful catalog and experience. And actually, there is a display there which has some of the catalog and even the photographs of the ROCI Malaysia opening and journey. So for me, I love the turtle. And actually, I was really delighted to learn that ROCI was named after the turtle, Rauschenberg's pet turtle, who was called ROCI. So the name Rauschenberg oversees cultural interchange. The acronym is not only that, but it's also a play on Rocky the turtle. And he obviously loved, I don't know if that's Rocky himself, but probably. But also I think, we were talking in the car just now, Eden mentioned actually the turtle was very important in Malaysia at the time too, right? There was this whole penyu thing, and I think it was a symbol of Malaysia in the 90s. For sure it was. More than now it's like the sun bear or others, but at that time it was definitely the turtle, so there was definitely a link with this. So it's a very ideal cover. So the interesting thing about this catalog is, so when we were first discussing it, we thought that it was a bilingual, like we do now with the catalogs, and all the Ilham catalogs are translated bilingually, and that's the way we do things now. But actually in the 1990s, quite surprisingly, I was surprised to see that it was totally in Malay. There was no English in this catalog at all, actually. It was completely in Malay. And this is just the, maybe I should use the laser. So this is the contents, the table of contents. So you can see there's a little introduction of Rauschenberg. There's an essay, a really extensive essay by Robert Hughes, which was an earlier essay which I believe was published in Time magazine. Extensive essay. There's an introduction by Donald Saf, and there is a wonderful essay by Professor Muhammad Haji Saleh, who was a key figure, again, an incredible translator, a poet as well, and a scholar. But also, I think Professor Muhammad really comes from that generation of intellectuals and artists and writers of this time in Malaysia who were really thinking about things like translation and things like intercultural dialogue in a way. Everything they did was not only linguistically to translate knowledge into Malay, but I think to people like Professor Muhammad, and definitely people like Ismail Zain as well, and Syed Ahmad Jamal, who was the director of the Balai Seni Lukis at the time. But Ismail Zain as well, we worked on a project of Ismail Zain's writings, and something about Ismail Zain that really struck me is that he was always trying to translate concepts, not just linguistically, it was really about explaining what are these concepts to foreign concepts into Malay, but also Malay concepts into English or into modern Malay, in a way. Like taking things like from the oral traditions, talking about things like wayang kulit, talking about things like traditional motifs or mythology, and trying to interpret them into the contemporary understanding. So it's not, these levels of translation, I think, are not only, they're never just linguistic. They really go beyond just a translating, I mean, actually, it's never just word for word. It's also just beyond translating a text. It is really trying to translate an entire experience and trying to translate an entire way of seeing. So I think what struck me particularly, I'm just going to show you some of those. So this, one thing I find really funny, actually, is that I find this Selamat Datang Robert Rauschenberg a little bit funny because it looks a little bit like a tourist magazine. And the way he's there with his bag and with his tan skin and everything, to me it's a little bit like Visit Malaysia Catalogue. But in any case, but also it's interesting to see some of the names here. This is the penghargaan page. I don't know if you can actually see, it's a little bit, okay, there's like Yang Berhormat Datuk Sabaruddin Chik and people like that. But in all of that, I was looking for the name of the translator and I could not find one. So I actually don't know, in all this great work of translation that they did for this catalogue, we actually don't know who translated it. I don't know if it was Professor Muhammad Haji Saleh, I don't know if it was Ismail Zain or if it was just some unnamed officer in the Balai. The translator is not named, which is actually a very bad practice, terrible practice. So at least we haven't, I know that Ilham doesn't do that. But in any case, so they take this, it's almost like they wanted to make it invisible. You know, it's as if, oh, this is just a Malay publication and we're putting out this knowledge in Malay. And I don't know why they didn't think about that, but at that time, so if you think about Dewan Bahasa itself, the founding of Dewan Bahasa, or maybe not just the founding, but the first publication of Dewan Bahasa was a translation. It was a translation of Mark Twain's The Prince and the Pauper by Zaba. That was the first book that they ever published, was a translation. And that says a lot about actually the sensibility of the importance of literary translation in the entire nation-building project, I think, and the entire, even Dewan Bahasa's, I mean, wish they would remember it a bit more, but you know, that's how they were founded. It's like part of their DNA. So this idea of literary translation or knowledge translation is, so everything, and there are many, everything is even the titles, which I think nowadays we don't always do that. We don't, if a title is in English, we don't always necessarily translate it into Malay because we want to leave the title as the title. But they translated every single thing, including every single title of the works into Malay. So there's this introduction by Donald Saf. There is this is a really wonderful essay, actually. I think it's still very insightful. I don't know if it's been translated into English. I wouldn't mind translating it into English, but it's a wonderful essay. And I think the thing that I love about how Professor Muhammad talks about this is not just looking at or trying to analyze Rauschenberg. He's also asking, he starts actually by saying the intellectual tradition of Southeast Asia tends to look at art in this way. And we have been, this is the way we look at art, this is the way we understand, and we understand experience of art should be actually things that are perhaps more direct, more tangible, or not so much in terms of abstract concepts. And I think what he's trying to say is that we need to shift our understanding or open our worldview to also embrace this kind of art, so that when we look at it, because he actually uses this interesting term and says that an ordinary Malaysian looking at this art would feel, I think he says something like tiga kali terasing or something, 3 times removed from, or 3 times estranged from the art, and then he's thinking about how would an ordinary Malaysian understand this, and then he goes into this about how we need to shift some of our concepts, what Rauschenberg is doing in essence. So I think it's valuable. If Ilham wants to ask me to translate it, I wouldn't mind. Just offering it, putting it out there. So then this is a long essay by Robert Hughes, Nikmat Seni Lukis. I mean, it's actually good translation. I think it's actually well translated. I don't know who did it. But this is all very valuable work. I don't know if you can actually share the PDF with whoever's interested to, but Kajin shared the entire PDF with me, so it makes for really interesting reading. If anyone wants to actually, it's on the website actually. It's on the ROCI website of the Rauschenberg Foundation. So anyone who reads Malay and really wants to delve into it more, you can really read this. And then it shows some of his, it doesn't only show the work for the ROCI Malaysia, but it shows quite a lot of the work from the other ROCI projects. But this was some of the work that was shown. I don't know if it's in this exhibition. Are these two here as well? No, maybe not. Bunga Manggis, and then we have this one, which I like very much, Tuak Hudok, the Iban rice wine dog. So I don't know how much time he spent in each place, but he went to quite a few places. He went to, Malacca, Penang, Kuala Lumpur, of course, Kelantan, Terengganu, and Sarawak. And of course, being a visitor, I mean, again, when you Merantau in that way, how much can you actually take in? How much can you experience and encounter that? And how deep can you go? Of course, his Merantau in this way definitely was very intentional. It was very organized in a way, with his wild impulse, of course, but it's still very organized. It's quite unlike something like Latif going to Berlin as a very young poet and artist and just discovering things. I mean, I think Rauschenberg's time here would have been quite curated as well, right? So it's also a question of who is curating that experience for you, who are your the hosts here, what you choose to, or what they choose to show you and what they don't, what you discover for yourself. All of those things, I think, add to the experience of any Merantau, of any journey. But I think, again, the layering, I like Rauschenberg's approach of layering things, because I think it has this sense that nothing is totally final, and it's not, also not necessarily contained in one object. For me, it gives that sense of things that something is always evolving, and even that experience, and even as a memory, an experience that's passed, even as a memory, it can still keep evolving, and it can still keep changing with your perception and how you understand it, or what it means for you. The significance and the meaning that you draw from that Merantau experience also changes, and it's not something stuck in time. And as you encounter, after the initial encounter, I think then as an artist or as a writer or even as a translator, it's the same when you go back to your work. You can keep drawing from it, you can keep interpreting it, and you can keep engaging with it. It's not something that's actually finished. So I really like that idea. Okay, so then we quite naturally fall into then translation. So I've just put down some ideas. These are not theories at all. I'm not a academic theorist at all. These are just things that I think maybe perhaps insights that and the ways I like to sometimes think about translation through my practice, and it's not like from when I started translating, I definitely wasn't thinking about any of this stuff. I think it's only now that I've been translating for like 20 odd years and translating all kinds of things, and not only translating, but also involved in many other things like writing, cultural work, and all of that. But I do think of translation as a kind of Merantau, because if you look at the root words itself of translation, in a few languages, in English, for example, that I suppose from the Latin, right, translatio, it does mean something to carry across. And even in German as well, übersetzen means to carry. It's like to place something from one place to another, to carry across something. Also I think with, if I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm wrong, whoever knows Arabic here, but I believe the Malay terjemahan comes from tarjama, the root word tarjama in Arabic, which somebody told me is not only an idea of translating language, but it's also something about this, it used to be related to something like sacred knowledge, to bring it into a more concrete form. So I think those are some of the roots as well. But for me, Merantau has always been this sense, and here I'm going to actually invoke one of my great gods of everything, who is Paul Celan, who I did translate into Malay, but he was a great translator as well. Of course, Celan was one of the great poets of the German language. He was one of the great translators for me, because he's not as well known as a translator, but I think his translation, when I read some of his translated work, that he translated people like Osip Mandelstam into German, and even Emily Dickinson. He translated Emily Dickinson into German. When you read his translations, they're absolutely powerful, and I actually find that they are works of art as powerful as the original. And so for me, certainly, not with everything, but certainly with poetry, when I translate poetry, especially, or fiction, I try to aspire to that. I do try to aspire to this sense of becoming another work of art. Not separate from, but to really push the greatness of the work into another language. But the sense of Merantau, so Paul Celan, he always talked about translation as, he called it Fergendienst, which is like a ferryman, the work of a ferryman, and ferrying across, like from, not only from one side of the river to the other, but actually there's also, if you think of the image of the ferryman, and actually in Celan it's very much present, omnipresent in some of his work, that this ferryman is also life and death. It's not only language to language, it is actually between those shores of life and death. And for him, let me just see, did I put something by Celan down here? I think I did. Anyway, later we'll come to it. There is a quote that's by Celan that I hold really close, because it's just his approach to language. And I think for people like him, and of course we don't all feel as intensely this way about language all the time, because we didn't experience what Celan did. And Celan actually, when he struggled with language, because he was born into a Jewish enclave in, at the time was Cernowitz, but German speaking. German was his mother tongue. And then he was born into this time, and most of his family were perished in the Holocaust. But yet he had to write, because it was his mother tongue, he wrote in German, which was actually the language of the murderers of his family and everything, right? So for him, when he lost everything, for him, language was like the one thing he had left. It was the one thing he held on to make sense of the world. But the only way he could do that, not only through his poetry, was also to transform it so totally and put it through what he said, I think it's like 1,000, we'll come to that quote later, I think. But he had to put his own language through this process of sort of reconfiguration. And so by the time he was writing his poetry, it was so different, I think, and so powerfully, radically different from definitely the earlier, what we think of as the German poetic tradition. So absolutely different and powerful. So I've always thought that kind of grappling with language We may not experience it in the same way, but it's always urged me to look at language as something that has that kind of potential power. So when I translate, I do try to hang on to that as much as I can to say that language has this power. If it had this power for Ceylon, and it has this power, it has that also, of course, if you think of sacred mantras, I mean the word, right? That word, the sound even, not necessarily the written text, but the sound. And working with oral traditions, you understand it as well very much, that the power of the word is something that that still today in our age of too much information and AI and all of that, I think it still resonates. That human aspect of sound, of word, and of language still has a kind of, I don't want to say sacred, but it's a sublime power, I think. Yes, to come back to Merantau, I've always seen it as that kind of journey on that sort of river, that Ceylon-like river between these shores, you know, between language, one, experience, culture as well, and also life and death. If you take it to that, if you hold that power, it can have that power. So that's how I've liked to think of it. The other thing is translation as a kind of palimpsest layering. The word palimpsest comes from this idea of where you have a manuscript, like an ancient manuscript, and that ancient manuscript is not just, or it's also like a layer of, a geological layer, right? If think about geological layers, where every age or every civilization adds another layer to something, but the layers beneath do not disappear. So if you think about translation in that way, and again, these are not like academic concepts, okay? They are just the way I like to approach things. As I'm looking at a text and I'm thinking, you know, how much should I? A lot of it is instinctual. I don't have any formulas you just learn it actually, and you refine as you go along. And as the more you translate, I think the more you grapple with language and the more you refine your approach. But these are some ways in which I'm thinking about it, is that as you do go into, particularly with some work like Ceylon again or poetry, there are literally layers that you can go into. And if you want to excavate, particularly, and you can give yourself that time sometimes to go into one word even. So sometimes if you look at the text, you can think of it as a sort of palimpsest, if you like. And if you want to particularly go into that particular word, and a lot of it is subjective. If it's something like you're translating a poem, you might be drawn to a particular word you want to highlight, or this particular concept you want to highlight, which will be different from another translator. It's not that there is any such thing as, I think, perfect and, again, final translation, because like for example, the translator, who was a dear friend of mine, the late Pierre Joris, who spent his life translating Ceylon. He translated the entire poetic works of Ceylon, and he spent 50 years doing it. So I feel like, okay, my 10 years translating Ceylon's, some of his poems into Malay is not so bad, but it's like that. I think with Ceylon it's one of those things that you start translating him and you translate him for life. Most of his translators end up like that, because I think it's just this obsessive connection with the poet and with his work. But Pierre Jory also spent his life translating Ceylon, and I saw him going deeper and deeper and deeper into one word. You know, by the time he was at the end of his life, his understanding of a particular word in a Ceylon poem, and you know, that I've read many times, but I would have never thought about it that way. Just his depth of understanding was incredible, you know. And so it's something I aspire to. I mean, not everyone can do that, but it takes a lot of time and dedication, but it's possible to go that deep. And that is inspiring to me. So the other thing is then, okay, translation as, I want to touch a little bit on this, because this is translation as Fortleben, which is the concept by Walter Benjamin, who was a great German thinker, who influenced me a lot as well, actually. So Walter Benjamin wrote an incredible essay, very influential essay, called Die Aufgabe des Übersetzers, which is the task of the translator. And in it, he argues many things. He talks about how, of course, translation should not only, that the task of the translator is not only to make the original work live in your language, or that the sense, when you bring it into that language, one is that there's this idea of that, how visible should you be, right? How much of the presence of the translator do you want to feel? So one is that there are two ways of thinking about it. One is that you can actually try to make yourself invisible. And perhaps for some texts you should. You don't want to put in too much of yourself in there for certain texts. But for some other texts, you actually do. I mean, I think Celan absolutely put himself in when he was translating Emily Dickinson. You read his translation, and it's 50% Emily and 50% Celan. Absolutely him. There's no other person who could translate it like that. So you can do that. But there's the thing is also to, I think what Benjamin also said is that to make that, so your translated work, you should still feel something of the original in that, I mean, for me, what how I understand it is that it should not only be a limpid, clear, transparent text when you're reading it. You do still want the reader to know that there is something beyond it. There is an original text. There are original ideas. It's a very difficult thing to do, actually, and it's not always successful. You can always aspire to these things. But the interesting thing about Fortleben is that also the term itself has been, it's been usually translated as afterlife. However, there's also a lot of debate about whether that translation is accurate, is appropriate, does it mislead or anything. So I would think that, so in the Western way of thinking about an afterlife, is usually that afterlife comes after life, after death, right? And then you have the afterlife, in a way. I think what Walter Benjamin, when he says sort of Fortleben, is more like actually a continuation. What he was saying is that the translation is the afterlife of a text. It's the Fortleben of a text, meaning that the original text lives on in its translation, but it doesn't mean it has died. Okay, it transforms. It's absolutely transformed, and actually it renews itself in that translation, and therefore that idea of sort of breathing new life into something, and then it has a life of its own. But if you think about perhaps our Eastern ways of thinking about afterlife, I think it's perhaps very much in sync, because we have all these cycles of renewal and many lifetimes and reincarnations and also multi-dimensions where things can exist on many planes at the same time, right? And many planes at once. You don't have to die for there to be an afterlife. There can already be an afterlife or another dimension just outside. Like in the Kuda Kepang, for example, which I've been engaging with a lot. It's like that alam tak nyata that exists outside of the alam nyata. It's there. You just have to access it. And you just have to bring it in to the experience. So I like to think about translation like that as well, that there is this other life or dimension that you kind of access, and then those two things can exist at once. One doesn't negate the other. One thing that translation is definitely not is a copy of something, and it should never aspire to be a copy of something, because it's not, and it never will be. And the translation will never be the original. So you shouldn't think that, for me, a good translation is not necessarily only how much it resembles the original. It's, that is, I think, the most direct and perhaps rudimentary way and approach to a translation, which to me does not approach at all the level of art yet. Okay, then very quickly also, sometimes I was thinking at one point about translation as counterpoint, in the Bach fugal way, and also counterpoint looking at just, if you know anything about music and counterpoint is that there are these two sort of melodic structures or patterns, if you will. One at the left hand, one at the right hand, treble clef, bass clef, and they come together. But they're having a conversation with each other. And together they kind of make this whole, this larger structure. But they never drown each other out. They absolutely, sometimes they seem to be challenging each other. But they always sort of come together as a whole in this sort of perfect structure. And so another thing, I've sometimes liked to think about translation like that I'm having this real conversation with the author. And I do actually have these conversations with most of the authors that I translate. Not all, but many of them are dead. And so when they are dead and I can't have real conversations with them, I do have conversations with them in my head, and I think like, how would Celan or Kafka talk to me? And the other thing is counter beat. So this is, again, a Celan concept. Gegentakt. This is what, and actually he also used Gegenwort. So he used this in one of his poems, Gegentakt, which is, I think it's Alle Seelen, but he's like, there's this line he says, which is, it's, wo der Puls den Gegentakt wagte, something like that, which is like where my pulse dared the counterbeat. And he was talking about barbed wire, so barbed wire, where my pulse dared the counterbeat. And for him, that counterbeat, and then later what became the counter word, was his absolute reconfiguration of the German language. What he was talking about, that counterbeat against language, against the German poetic tradition, against all of that. And then sometimes I like to, if you're translating someone like Celan, you can do this kind of thing. And you try to make your translation something that is other than the conventional norm. We just to not fall into perhaps the easiest solution, not fall into the easiest cliched way. It's because sometimes you think that the first thing that comes to you in a language, perhaps that's the most natural thing, or perhaps that's the easiest way of saying something in this language. But I always like to take time a bit and really contemplate it a bit more so that you can look at sometimes more unconventional ways. Not just, you also don't want to be contrived, and you don't do that with every single word or every single line, of course. But there are areas, and I think as an experienced translator, you can sort of suss out those areas which you want to bring out and highlight. And again, translation is always an act of interpretation. It is never just a clean. This is why AI fails completely, because they do not have that kind of human element. And also even the beauty of error sometimes. Actually, I think what all these things, these processes urge us to, including translation, is also the beauty of error. Sometimes you need to make errors, and you need to completely fail, and you need to do that to understand the process, and to really understand the process, and to encounter in your own practice what it is that, like a challenge, a real challenge, that you have to grapple with in your own way, and no one will grapple with it in the same way. But unless you have that, you're never going to actually evolve as a translator, as a writer, as a thinker, or as an artist, right? And so AI trying to make these perfect things that have absolutely no soul and absolutely no, for me it's just human folly. Anyway. Okay, and then the last one, there's a lot of Celan in here. Anyway, this is also a Celan concept, actually. It's also Atemwende. It's related, actually, to the Gegentakt as well. And I think so, Atemwende means, Atem is breath, and Wende is like this turning point, or could even be like revolution, So I think with Celan, the larger idea of what that Gegentakt does, or that Gegenwort, is that perhaps you could say spiritually, just or more totally, his reconfiguration of language, or his grappling with language, would lead to an entire Atemwende, which is like an entire reconfiguration of the self through language. I mean, he actually thought about language that deeply. So these are sort of ideals or concepts I try to hold close to me when I'm translating. Doesn't happen all the time, and I don't think I'm successful all the time. Certainly if I'm like in a rush deadline and translating some captions or something, it doesn't happen. But you know, if I'm translating a work of a poem or something that I give myself time for, then I try to really hold close to these concepts. Okay, just I wanted to think about a parallel actually. So Rauschenberg's practice of solvent transfer, I think my hair is coming undone, never mind. But his practice of solvent transfer, I find also very instructive as a way of thinking about translation as well, because I love, and I was asking Kajin to explain to me the technique, because I didn't really totally understand what was involved. And Kajin explained to me and also directed me to some places where I could learn more. And it does seem to me to have many parallels to the process of translation, because you use these sort of, I suppose, chemicals, right? Like, I don't know the artistic terms, but sort of solution, right? It's kind of chemical solution. And you have this work, like a print, I suppose. So you could, and I think Rauschenberg used a lot of things like even magazines and newspapers, where you soak this, or you layer on this solution, and then you press it down upon another surface, and press it in, and the impression that you get, and depending on where you place your weight, or that emphasis, or how much pressure you put, you'll get a different pattern, right? You'll get a different kind of thing that comes, and what you get on the other side is not a copy, it's not an exact copy, but it is something like, for me, it's like a translation, right? It's like, this is it's the residue, it's that, but it's also a work of art. It is something in and of itself. Like some of these works are actually done by the solvent transfer process. It's a work in and of itself, which is not the original, but it's something which has the soul of the original, but absolutely has its own identity and value. So, yeah. And then I wanted to just also link back to, I think also there's a huge link with the Dada artists, and I think Rauschenberg himself did mention particularly Kurt Schwitters as a huge influence on him. And Dada itself, again, like the Bauhaus, was this really radical art movement in Germany, not only in Germany, also in France, but these Dada artists with these really incredible, radical beings, and they use this kind of collage a lot. And so many of Rauschenberg's artworks reminded me of this, and I can actually see the influence of Schwitters on his work very, very much. So, okay, oh, there's Celan. Okay, I should put him earlier, but this is Celan. Okay, just for you to actually read what Celan wrote about language. It had to go through the 1,000 darknesses of murderous speech, his reconfiguration of language. And that's a copy of my translation of Celan. Anyone wants a copy, you can come and talk to me. Okay, this is a little bit of, because Kajin asked me to just quickly show a little bit of my translations from other languages into, well, I've just picked two, and I'll just go through them very quickly. So I recently translated, not that recently, a couple of years ago, translated some short stories by Fatima Busu, who's an incredible woman writer, who's been kind of sidelined by the literary establishment for a long time. And I published a book of short stories by her with Penguin in Southeast Asia. For me, again, a lot of it's instinctual, to be very honest. I can't say that I was, this is how I did Fatima Busu because I set out to translate like that. I didn't. Actually, the main thing for me to translate when it's my own project is that I fall in love with a work of literature or a text, and it grasps me so much that I say, I really want to translate this. And for me, that act of translating is a kind of act of love in a way, because it's just that I love this text so much that I want to sit with it for a while. I want to read it as closely as I can, and I want to listen to it as deeply as I can. And for me, that close reading, it's the closest form of reading, is to translate a text. And it's the deepest way of listening. And I think listening is really important, because you really need to listen to the text before you start to hear it in your own language. So I've always noticed that, is that before I even pick up a pen and start to translate anything, is that I really need to hear that text. And if I don't hear it, I probably don't have the urge to translate it even. It's just that when I love a text so much, then I start hearing it in English, or I read something and I start hearing it in Malay or something, then I'm thinking, oh gosh, I really need to bring this into another language. But this was just like, this is the first line, and this is one of my favorite stories in that selection. It's called Maha Asmara, which is her retelling of the legend of Putri Gunung Ledang. And it's a very kind of naughty, radical way of telling the story of Putri Gunung Ledang, because she's not this like pristine princess at all. She's this kind of a bratty adolescent princess who goes around seducing all the rajas of Nusantara and then brings them to their knees. So I love it. But this is, I'm not going to read it out. You can read it, and then I'm just going to show you my translation of how I translated it. But I love Fatima's, right. Fatima just struck me with her language as well, I think. Before I read her name was very prominent, and I wanted to really read her. But I was actually quite surprised and amazed when I read her, because I thought, my goodness, she's really not like anything I've ever read. Certainly not what I was expecting. I wasn't expecting her to be so radical. She's a lot more radical than I imagined. But I translate it as the dowry of desire. So, yeah, even though Asmara is not necessarily, in the literal way, is not necessarily desire, but in the story, because actually what comes out in the story is so much about the Sultan's follies and their kind of blind greed and desire beyond everything else. So that's how I translated, and I think it worked. I think it worked well. But this is this is the first line of the story that I translated. And another one. This is an interesting one, because Kule Grassi is a poet from Sarawak who I translated some years ago, and I'm translating some of his work now as well. But I love this poem in particular. This is the first poem that opens the book of Talmi Kenyalang. And this was actually very challenging to translate, also because Kule doesn't only use Malay. He uses many indigenous languages in his Malay. So his primary text is Malay, but it's very layered. So it's very sort of like this palimpsestic text that has so many layers, and it's both text and oral tradition at the same time. So the other thing is, when Kule writes text, many of his poems have that quality of the oral tradition. And so it's also translating not only how something looks on the page, but you really need to hear it. And actually a lot of the process of translation for this one I had to do with Kule himself, because also, I mean, I don't speak Iban or Kenya or the other, even uses some Penan. He speaks many different languages, even though he is Iban himself. But this one, I think, was from the Kenya. The first part of the book was more Kenya. And, I mean, if you read it, it's Malay, but it's not quite. And this, so I highlighted the ones that are highlighted in red is how in the book, the designer laid it out, and he sort of made the indigenous words, that some of which I left untranslated, because I've realized that actually it doesn't totally make sense to translate them into English. Not everything. Some things should be left in an original language, also because sometimes some words are there also for the presence. And it's important to retain that presence in the original language, even in a translation. So sometimes when you translate, you don't need to translate every single word. Sometimes it's good to leave it there so that the presence of a particular line or word is there. But this is my translation. And akui means I in the Khmer language. And again, I think, actually, if I reflect now, I do think that I tried to apply some of the Celanistic approach to translation when I was translating Kule, for sure, because something that Celan likes to do, not only in his translation but in his poetry, is do a lot of word combinations that don't exist even though in German you can put together many words and make it a new word, but he did that a lot with sort of unexpected combinations. And so when I was approaching Kule's work, I think that's one of the things that struck me is that, you can do that. You can actually, in the translation, you can create new words, like sun squint, like tear stones, heart fist, and things like that. And not everything needs to make logical sense. This is also the beauty of poetry, is that poetry, so when you talk about meaning, right, we're talking about translation, sometimes we think we need to translate what this means into another language. Actually, not always. Sometimes meaning is not the most important thing, and especially when it comes to things like poetry. I actually think sometimes it's sound that is very important. So some poems, even in the original language, meaning is not the most important thing. And there is meaning. It does not mean they are devoid of meaning. There is a meaning there, but it's not the logical meaning that we are used to, that we always look for with our analytical mind. In fact, things like poetry and things like art and music are spaces in which you can unravel that logical, overly rational approach to understanding. And so sometimes the purpose of a work of art, or purpose of certainly a poem, and music for sure, and I love music because you don't have to think through language or it's just a very immediate way of experiencing the world, is that you can really unravel the rational, the overly rational. And it comes back to like Ilse Noor essay, where how we live now in this like really disenchanted age, right? That we're so overly rational, and we're so overly, we're so dependent on precision and meaning, and I think poetry is a space, and literature is a space, and certainly art and music and all of that, all the various forms of art is a space for us to release ourselves from the tyranny of rationalism. It's one of those few spaces perhaps we have left in the postmodern, postmodern, whatever world we're living in now, to reconnect with that sense of enchantment and the ability to be enchanted, right? Yeah. Okay. I think there's not that much left. Okay, I just wanted to very quickly show, because I thought this was so beautiful. So we're probably coming to, how much time do we have? Okay. Just very quickly, I wanted to show some things that I came across, and we discussed also, because Rauschenberg himself had a very beautiful and powerful link with literature as well. And in fact, some of those beautiful solvent transfer works that he did an entire series of illustrations through the solvent transfer process for an edition of Dante's Inferno. And it was a translated work. He was working, there was a scholar, and it was a translation into English of Dante's Inferno. But this is the first one, I think, The Dark Wood of Error. So series of 34 illustrations. I absolutely love them. And the interesting thing is that he didn't try to make Dante's Inferno, this is also very much interpretation, right? And very much translation of what he feels is the Inferno, not only of Dante, but of our times, or how Dante speaks to our times. Because so many of the images that he was using also, you can see these very contemporary images. I think there's like a figure of Kennedy. There are these figures of very contemporary, recognizable. There's a Mona Lisa somewhere. There's all these things, right? I think there's another one here. I think there's Kennedy in the background somewhere there, yeah. So I love this idea of taking these old ancient texts, and especially texts sometimes that we think are so, the canon, right? The great classical canon that we can't touch. And to interpret it like that, and to interpret it so radically, I think, to me, is a wonderful thing. And of course, Frank O'Hara. Okay, this is the other thing that I loved, is that actually Frank O'Hara, who's one of my absolute favorite poets of all time, had also a close friendship with Robert Rauschenberg. In fact, because Frank O'Hara was a curator and a art critic. If I'm not mistaken, he was one of the first to actually do a critique of Rauschenberg's early work, and really called him this great figure in the making. So, and later on, there was, but then Frank O'Hara, again, is one of those very multidisciplinary artists. He also had a deep friendship and relationship with Larry Rivers, who did these portraits of him, and they also embarked on these lithographs. This kind of lithograph by Frank and Larry Rivers. But also, then, did I put it in? Oh, no, I didn't. Okay, I wanted to put in. Actually, but later, Rauschenberg also did illustrations for a posthumous collection of Frank O'Hara died quite young, and very tragically, in fact, in an accident. But there was the kind of posthumous collection, and Rauschenberg did some of those, like a tribute publication for him. And then I think we come to the end, the very last slide, I think I put in an Andy Warhol slide because I just love this as well. And I think this was actually Andy Warhol. If you can see, it's Robert Rauschenberg in the photographs over here. So he used this, and I love the kind of humor that some of them, and tribute. This was a tribute to Rauschenberg in a way, because he was using the silkscreen process that was also very much pushed and pioneered, and also this kind of transfer technique. But he called it also, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, which is also a tribute to Walker Evans. And I think there was a very famous book that Walker Evans had done in the 1940s, I think, on the photographing workers from the South during the Great Depression. And it was a famous kind of like photo essay book. And Andy Warhol named it after Walker Evans, but it was also a tribute to Rauschenberg. But I love these connections, and I just wanted to share them. But that brings me to the end of our discussion. I hope I didn't meander Merantau too much to elsewhere. But just to wrap up, and while I catch my breath, I wanted to actually end with a poem by Frank O'Hara, that Frank O'Hara wrote for Robert Rauschenberg. And I'm going to ask Edin to read it while I catch my breath. Just as a tribute to, yeah.
Yes. I see I'm next to you. This is a poem by Frank O'Hara, simply entitled For Bob Rauschenberg. Yes, it's necessary. I'll do what you say, put everything aside but what is here. The frail instant needs us, and the cautious breath, so easily drowned in list or sucked out by a vulgar soprano. Why should I hear music? I'm not a pianist anymore, and in truth I despise my love for Pasternak. Born in Baltimore. No, Sasha, mine. And an adolescence taken in hay above horses. What should I be if not alone in pain? Apart from the heavenly aspirations of Spencer and Keats and Ginsberg, who have a language that permits them truth and beauty, double coin. Exercise, recreations, drugs. What can heaven mean, up, down, or sideways? Who knows what is happening to him? What has happened and is here? A paper rubbed against the heart and still too moist to be framed.
I love that last line. That
Yeah.
last line is,
Yeah.
I think for me, really encapsulates Rauschenberg.
So I think what we'll do is we'll open for a few questions. I think the kind of translation issue, funnily enough, is having a huge moment now culturally as well, because of the movie The Odyssey, and this the significant controversy over the translation that Christopher Nolan has picked to become the basis of the movie. The Emily Wilkinson translation, which uses entirely contemporary language, like "Hey you" kind of casualness, as opposed to very classical kind of language. But yeah, I think that's kind of like an interesting moment we find ourselves in. So are there any questions from the audience, perhaps? Open to any and all questions about translation, about the... Yes, please.
Hello there. That was a very enchanting speech. The way, you said it absolutely encapsulated everything I came here for. But my question is, since you mentioned translations as palimpsestic, as one of the ways of viewing translation, I was just thinking, since you also mentioned that meaning is not necessarily the most important part to be taken away from poetry, then how do we, going into the future, if we have all of these levels on top of each other, how do we attempt to not dilute the soul of the original work? I think that's what I'm like to ask. Thank you.
I think that's something that as a literary translator you always struggle with, is that how much, especially, I think it's something I struggle with or grapple with more and more as I understand the art of translation more and more, because I think what you want to do is always, you do want to be, do justice to your own art, for sure, but you also want to do justice to the original, and you don't want to compromise in any way the original. I do think it's something that perhaps has a parallel in music sometimes, if you think of how a pianist, for example, plays a work of a composer who is not here anymore, but obviously there's that work that has to be interpreted. But I think in music, we do appreciate the interpretation of the pianist. So what we call a great pianist is someone who has both the technical mastery as well as who gives it a depth with insight, with their interpretation. And sometimes that comes with many, many years of not just mastering the technicality of playing an instrument, but understanding the music. And I think it's as you can play the same piece at the beginning of when you first get into whatever, or you can even translate, just example of the same work. And then 20 years later, you can look at the same work and you would translate it completely differently, because you've come then with your experience and all the Merantau, everything you've gathered on all your different Merantaus is now informing that work. And so you're not the same, you're the same person, but you've transformed as well. And so even that can transform. I think it's not an easy thing to say. There's certainly no one answer, certainly no formula. I think if you are true to yourself as a translator at every step of your journey, that not just true but critical of yourself as well. You have to actually be very critical of yourself and not be, sometimes when you think this translation is really crap, what the hell was I doing? You should really be honest with yourself and not be so kind to yourself, right? Not everything is like, oh, this is so artistic. No, sometimes it's just crap. So you must be honest with yourself. And also you should allow others to read and also give you criticism so that you evolve. But through that, again, you can't be so confined then by what others think or how, the conventions of translation that you just do the most conventional thing and it becomes totally lifeless. Who wants to hear a pianist who's just technically perfect but has absolutely no soul and interpretation? It's just flat. You don't even call it a piece of music, right? I think it's the same with translation. So ideally, again, you do bring that spirit into a work, particularly if it's a work of art. Yeah.
Hi, Pauline. How is translating a way of looking at the world?
I think inevitably, as a translator, you do listen to things perhaps more deeply. And I think because we are working with an other all the time, we're always in conversation with another text or in conversation with an artist or a figure. So I do think there is perhaps we are not always, but more open to things like dialogue and listening and taking ourselves out of something before we impose ourselves. I certainly think that's how I approach not only my translation work, but everything else. And I think it informs even the work that I do with culture. I sit and listen to my communities a lot. And I think perhaps being a translator, or maybe it's the other way around, like maybe sitting with masters of traditional arts as well has also helped me to listen more when I translate. But I'm always careful not to put too much of my own opinions into something first, particularly at first reading. And I think you can get bolder once you feel more familiar. It's like working with another person or working with another artist, that you always have to make space for the other as well. It's not just about you and what you want to express and what you want to say, right? Because there is the other work of art. And there is, beyond the other work of art, there is, I mean, for me, it's like the hovering presence of Celan. You know, I'd never want to, if I'm translating Celan or if I'm translating Fatima Busu, you know, it's not just that work, but it's them as well. It's like, I want to do justice to them as a person and as everything that they have brought into the world with their work. So subconsciously, I think I always carry that with me. But then again, you also don't want to be so, you don't want to just put them on the pedestal and say, oh, they're these just great people and you can't touch their work. Then it can inhibit you as a translator as well. So I think you have to strike that balance. And I think the best way is to have just to forge a very personal relationship with them. Whether it's living or dead authors. I mean, that's why I talk to my dead authors, because I imagine they're actually talking to me. But you have to do that. I think you actually have to have that conversation but even with Fatima Busu, for example, it's not like I talk to her all the time. I mean, I talk to her quite often, but even when I'm not talking to her about the work, I can still hear her, or I imagine what she would be saying, or I imagine, what she might think. So you are always having that other conversation with the other text, the other person, the other artist, for sure. That, I think, is a way of seeing and experiencing the world.
Any other? Yes.
Thanks, Pauline. That was beautiful. I think you should turn what you said on translation into an essay. No, you should. Yeah. But you're also unusual, I think, in the sense that you work with multiple languages, but you translate from Malay, but you also translate into Malay. Is there a difference when you're doing either?
Yeah, for sure. There is definitely a difference. I think I'm quite selective about what I translate into Malay. It's not my first language. And I do like to work with Malay in a sort of poetic way. So I love to do the things like translate Celan or also some others into Malay, even Rilke and people like that. Because I think there's a bit of an openness, and I love the Malay language. I think the Malay language has so many possibilities, poetic possibilities. It's a very versatile language, and it's a very sensual language by nature. Not all languages are sensual by nature. I mean, German isn't really, but it can be. I mean, this this is the wonderful thing about sometimes working with a language and trying to work perhaps not against, but to bring out another aspect of it that is unexpected. So, and when you work with language, I think that is one of the most interesting things. Like, I mean, you don't necessarily expect German to be sometimes very central, but it can really be in some of Salan's work, or even Trakel, not so much central, but very, it can be very soft as well, gentle. And you don't always expect that, right? And then likewise, I think English sometimes, to me, it also, I grapple with it a lot because English, we tend to, because there's so much English around us all the time, I think as a translator into English, you actually have to perhaps work even harder to listen to what is the register of English and your own voice in English, because it's so easy to get drowned out by all the Englishes out there and all the dominant language of everything out there, you know, from the language of information, marketing, media, global, everything is just in English, right? Most of it, not all of it, of course, but it's dominant. And so it's very easy for us as translators to lose our sense of hearing what is our language in English. And so when I do translate in English, you might think it might be easier, but actually it's not. It's because you have to actually shut out the world more. So I feel like when I'm translating into English, I need to actually isolate myself perhaps more, or at least isolate myself spiritually, or whatever it is, right? To try to listen deeper to myself, which is why I end up translating very late at night, because it's like the quietest time when I can hear myself and nothing else is, except my cats are around. But, you know, it's not this drowning out of social media, of everything, of work emails and all of that, which can just really get in the way of language. So sometimes you have to like pull yourself away from the everyday language, particularly if you're and isolate yourself, because language is something that is omnipresent everywhere, right? So and because that is the medium, how do you? So that's why actually for meaning again, it's not just about getting the meaning across. It's like what kind of register, what kind of tone, what kind of. You really need to sit with it for a while. Which is why I also don't like to rush translations. I like to take my time with them.
Okay. I think on the note of kind of omnipresence, I think that and ways of seeing, I think that's a really good note to end today's event on. I think one of the ideas behind this event, as well as a thread running through ROCI, is really how do we reinterpret what's around us? How do we re-look at the kind of everyday? And I think I hope that if anything, what I will take away and what I hope people take away is that there's the kind of like very intentional translation that we're very aware of, and then there's the everyday translations that we watch Dear You in the cinema and we read the subtitles, and there's so much translation there that I hope that perhaps we can think about, that perhaps we can be more aware of. I think we find ourselves in a cultural moment where, for one reason or another, translation is also very politically explosive. There's nothing more, I think, potent than when someone says, "You've mistranslated me," or "You've twisted my words." That's such a powerful accusation. So I think on that note, we'll end today's event. If any of you would like to speak to Pauline after this, please feel free to come up, and I'm sure there's lots more to talk about. Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Pauline, for being here today.
Thank you so much, Kajin. Thank you.